This process has been around for thousands of years. It is the original way to make bread, and that's what draws me to it so much, because it truly does create the most delicious bread that you'll ever eat. We are going to be talking about how to make your own starter in your home kitchen, and I'm very excited to share with you my techniques for these processes. Commercial forms of yeast that you can buy at the grocery store, they make the fermentation process go by like that. Very quick, a very easy way to get into baking bread. However, fermentation and bread itself is best when you have longer periods of that fermentation. So what you can do to make better bread and more delicious bread is use pre-fermented mixtures of flour and water. I'm gonna grab my scale, some flour, a little bit of water, and I'll walk you through everything. Get some of that water. All right, so I usually use a nice tall jar like this that's clear so that you can see your sourdough starter mixture starting to grow over time. And I also mix my mixture with a fork, okay? You can use anything else. You can use a rubber spatula, but a fork and a jar work just fine. Sourdough is just a culture of microorganisms. Naturally occurring yeasts are everywhere. They're on my hands, they're on this fork, they're on this jar, and the two most important ones that we're dealing with in sourdough are yeasts and lactic acid bacteria, all right? So I am using rye flour because whole grain rye flour is very nutrient dense, and it creates basically a breeding ground for these microorganisms. All I'm gonna do is combine equal amounts of flour and water together, okay? So today, I'm gonna put 50 grams of rye flour into my jar. Oh, I made a mess. There we go. And I'm going to zero out my scale and then add 50 grams of water. So what's gonna happen in this first day of my sourdough starter is that these starches are going to get broken down into glucose. The natural organisms in the air are going to start activating in this mixture. You're gonna see lactic acid bacteria combine with this glucose and basically create food for the yeast, the other organism that's in here. The yeast will start to eat that and create gas bubbles, air, and when that hits a hot surface, like our cast iron, you get bread. It's that simple. I would like to show you what your mixture should look like. As you can see, I just mixed it for, basically until my flour and water incorporated. There's no dry flour left, and it almost looks like some kind of porridge or oatmeal. I am going to just let this mixture sit on my countertop for 24 hours. Every day, you are going to add some new flour and water to your sourdough mixture. This process is commonly known as feeding your starter. I typically like to feed my starter first thing in the morning, but it does not matter the time of day that you choose to mix and feed your starter, whatever's convenient for your schedule. So now that I've shown you how to make your mixture from the very beginning, I'm gonna show you what your sourdough starter will look like after one day. All right, we didn't see any significant rise or fall. When your starter starts to rise and fall, you'll see some tracings on your jar, all right? And that's why it's important to use a see-through container so that you can see that rise and fall. But what we do see today, we see a lot of bubbles, almost like a frothy, bubbly situation. And what I want to do now is feed it, all right? However, we wanna add flour and water in the same ratio, all right? 1 part flour, 1 part water, 1 part sourdough. If you remember, we used 50 grams of rye flour and 50 grams of water. Therefore, we have 100 grams of sourdough starter, okay? Now, if I were to use a 1:1:1 ratio here, I would need to add 100 grams of rye flour and 100 grams of water. This would create a lot of sourdough starter. I mean, the jar would be like this full. So to be quite honest, you don't really need that much in the beginning. So what I'll do is I will simply discard half of this mixture And I just eyeball it, I don't really measure. So we've got about half the mixture here, which will be roughly 50 grams. We'll set that aside and we will execute our first feeding here. Turning on scale. We're gonna put our jar directly onto the scale, and I'm going to zero out my scale, and I will add 50 grams of flour. $50 grams of flour, again, we're gonna zero out, or you can just pour water in here until you get to 100. So we need 50 grams of water here. All right. So again, we're gonna take our fork here, give a good mix. Here is the consistency of our sourdough starter. It's fairly stable, it's thick. All right, it tastes great, it looks great. So we're gonna continue this process for a few days until we see the rise and fall of our starter, and that will be an indication to where we can now start to make our bread. So I will show you exactly how our sourdough starter looks after 4 to 5 days. Here we have a rye flour starter that is a few days old. 4 to 5 days is that sweet spot as long as it's in a stable environment. And we see the air pockets developing, we see nice bubbles, we have a nice gluten network here, we see a nice rise and fall, which is an indicator that we are now ready to use this sourdough starter to actually make bread that you will eat. And as you get familiar with this process, you're gonna be able to really understand your sourdough starter as each day passes. With all of that being said, what if you don't have rye flour? What if today is the day you wake up, you're like, I wanna make sourdough, but I just have AP flour or bread flour? Totally fine. You're just gonna have to make a couple of adjustments. I would use a little bit less water in your mixtures, and you need to have a little more patience. So, leaven, there's many different words for it. You might see it in different forms in French or English. A leaven is a way for us to create our sourdough starter to be in a form that's more optimal for different types of breads. We talked about why rye flour is optimal for kickstarting our sourdough starter. It's nutrient dense, but it doesn't have a strong protein content. I could take this sourdough starter, put it into my final bread recipe, but you're gonna find a denser interior, you're gonna find different characteristics that are very specific to rye flour. So building a leaven, it's gonna create something that I can use to make pizza or brioche or semitas or bagels. I could make pretty much anything with this leaven because of the types of flour that I'm gonna use to feed it. Now, when you're creating your leaven, you don't necessarily want a 1:1:1 ratio. I like to use 25% of starter when compared to the amount of flour I'm using. So for example, for this mixture, I'm gonna be using 200 total grams of flour, and I'm gonna use 50 grams of my very potent, mature sourdough starter. So 50 grams of sourdough starter. Ooh, I almost broke the bowl. Look at that, that's 50 exact. All right. We're gonna zero our scale out. We're gonna use 175 grams of water, which is a little bit less than the amount of flour that we're using. So we've got our water in. I'm gonna do 150 grams of all-purpose flour, and then 50 grams of whole wheat flour. We don't want 199. We want 200. So I have the ingredients I need in my bowl, and I'm going to just simply mix this up with my fork. All right. We're looking for this exact consistency here. So after this mixture is created, we're gonna let it rest at room temperature for about 4 hours, and then it will be ready to use in our final dough mix. So I like to simply cover it up. Again, you don't want any extra air getting in here and drying it out. So keeping it nice and covered. Plastic wrap's fine. We're gonna bring it over here to the counter. And lucky for you, I've made one already so that I can show you what it looks like when it's ready to add to our final dough. What we're looking for here, first and foremost, on the surface, we're seeing bubbles. That's obviously a good thing. We're seeing activity. So I could take this with my hands, and look how much stronger it is now. It's very strong. See that web-like structure? If, in comparison, we look at our rye starter, look how quickly it falls apart. Even though this sourdough starter, this rye starter is just as healthy. You're seeing some of the differences in using different flour types, different time periods for our sourdough starter to rest. All right, in this specific instance, our leaven, it's nice and strong as I showed you, and it's ready to add into our dough mix. I hope that you learned a lot about making your own starter. I encourage you to do it right now. Go make a mixture, have some patience, have some fun, and trust me, it's kind of an addictive process once you start. Probably you're gonna be obsessed with it, and you'll be making it a lot.